You think you're strong, Lieutenant? You're not. You just follow orders. Those words came from Commander Harris, my superior, my mentor, and the man I once trusted to have my back. But that day, in front of a dozen officers in the briefing room, he humiliated me. I stood there, holding a file I'd worked on for weeks, an operations report I'd spent nights perfecting. I knew it was solid, but when I tried to explain my findings, he cut me off mid-sentence, slammed the folder shut, and said, "Next time, learn your place before speaking out of turn." The room went silent. I could feel my ears burn. My hands were trembling, but I kept them behind my back. I swallowed my pride, because that's what women in uniform learn to do. Stay composed, no matter what's thrown at you. After the meeting, a few junior officers gave me those pitying looks, the kind that sting worse than insults. I walked out head high, but inside something cracked. In the locker room, I sat on the bench, staring at my reflection in the metal door. My badge gleamed back at me, a symbol of honor. But in that moment, it felt like a cage. That night, I went home to my small apartment just outside Fort Bragg. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor, kicked off my boots, and sat in silence. The hum of the fridge was the only sound. I replayed his words, "Learn your place." He used to say I was one of the best, that my discipline and focus would take me far. But lately, every time I voiced an idea, he'd find a way to cut it down. It wasn't about performance anymore. It was about control. He'd make comments about how I should smile more, or how assertive women often forget who's really in charge. I tried to ignore it. I told myself he was just old school, that I shouldn't take it personally. But deep down, I knew this was more than ego. It was punishment, for being smart, for being good at what I do, for being a woman who didn't bend easily. One Friday evening, as I was leaving the base, he stopped me. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low, his smile sharp. "You've got potential, if you learn how to take direction properly." I just nodded and walked away. But that night, I couldn't sleep, because his lesson wasn't about leadership. It was about reminding me of my place below him. And I'd had enough of pretending it didn't hurt. What he didn't know was that I kept every email, every comment, every witness who saw how he treated me. I didn't plan it that way, but instinctively, I started saving proof. Maybe some part of me always knew I'd need it. Because the thing about discipline, real discipline, is knowing when to follow orders and when to break silence. And I was done being silent. The next week, I was called into a small conference room on base, the kind with harsh fluorescent lights and chairs that scrape across the linoleum floor. Commander Harris was there, of course. Alongside him sat Major Thompson, a man I respected, and two other officers I barely knew. Their presence should have felt neutral, but it didn't. It felt like a trap. "You've made some questionable decisions recently," Harris began, flipping through a binder with exaggerated authority. "It's gotten to the point where I can't trust your judgment. We're reassigning you to administrative duties, effective immediately." My stomach dropped. Administrative? After everything I had accomplished? My operations reports, my field leadership, the missions I'd led flawlessly? I don't understand, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I thought I was performing well. Harris leaned back, fingers steepled. "Well, Lieutenant, this is about discipline, about knowing your role. Perhaps this reassignment will help you reflect on that." I wanted to protest. I wanted to shout that this was unfair, that I had evidence proving my decisions had saved time, resources, and even lives. But when I opened my mouth, the words got stuck. Because this wasn't just professional sabotage. It was personal. And then it hit me. The private messages, the offhand comments, the way he'd subtly questioned my competence in front of colleagues. All of it was intentional. Every humiliation, every sneer, every advice that felt like a lesson in obedience, it wasn't guidance. It was control. I left the room, my files tucked under my arm, and went back to my office. My hands shook as I closed the door behind me. The silence was thick, oppressive. I sat down at my desk and stared at the phone. My fingers hovered over it, unsure whether to call someone, anyone, who could help. And then my mind went to all the small sacrifices I'd made for this career. The late nights, the deployments, the time away from family. I thought of my mother's words when I joined. Be strong, but never let them take your voice. I realized he had been trying to take it for months. And for the first time, I felt something dark simmering inside. Not anger, exactly, but clarity. I thought back to the last field mission I'd led. The team had followed my instructions exactly, even when Harris had doubted me. Lives had been saved because I stood firm. And now, here he was trying to punish me for being competent, for being unafraid to speak up. I clenched my fists and whispered to myself, "Enough." That night, I started gathering everything. Every email where he questioned me unjustly, every report where he undermined my authority, every witness statement from colleagues who had seen his behavior firsthand. I even copied his texts that were subtly threatening, all stored securely on my personal laptop. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about preparing myself for the truth to be recognized. For accountability. I felt a strange sense of empowerment in that act. Each file I saved, each piece of proof I collected, reminded me that I wasn't helpless. I hadn't failed. He had chosen to betray me. And now I was choosing to fight back. I stayed up late that night, reviewing everything, making notes, planning. Every detail mattered, dates, times, words. Accuracy would be my weapon. And for the first time since the humiliation, I slept with a sense of purpose. Because I wasn't just planning to reclaim my role. I was planning to reclaim my dignity. The next morning, I didn't just wake up. I woke up to the weight of everything I had given for this career. I made my coffee in silence, the smell of dark roast filling my tiny kitchen. My apartment was bare, practical, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. I stared out the window at the early morning fog settling over the streets. It was peaceful in a way that contrasted sharply with the storm building inside me. I thought about the first day I had joined the base. Bright-eyed, eager, full of belief that competence alone would be enough to rise. I'd left home at 22, kissed my mother goodbye, and promised I'd make her proud. I had sacrificed relationships, weekends, even birthdays. I had taken the extra shifts, volunteered for extra training, and carried the weight of responsibility that most people would have buckled under. I had believed loyalty was everything. And in return, Harris had used it against me. One memory hit hard. The time he praised me after a difficult field exercise. "You're smart," he had said. "But remember, intelligence isn't enough. You need obedience." At the time, I had laughed, thinking it was harmless advice. Now, I realized that was the start of his subtle campaign of control. Every compliment had a shadow. Every nod of approval had a trap beneath it. I pored over the evidence I had gathered. Each file, each email, each witness note told a story of betrayal. It wasn't conjecture. It wasn't emotion. It was fact. And fact was power. I remembered the sleepless nights, lying in bed with my phone in hand, wondering if I was overreacting, wondering if I was imagining things, wondering if I'd be considered a troublemaker if I spoke up. But now, in the clarity of the morning light, I could see the truth. I hadn't imagined it. Every slight, every humiliation, every unjust reassignment had been real. And it had a name: abuse of authority. I decided that this wouldn't just be about getting my position back. This would be about showing him, showing anyone who thought they could diminish me, that accountability matters more than control. I made a list of every action I would take. Consult a lawyer familiar with military workplace misconduct. Secure all digital and physical evidence. Reach out discreetly to colleagues willing to corroborate my experiences. Ensure that my chain of command was aware of the pattern, without giving Harris the opportunity to destroy my credibility. The planning was methodical. Every decision deliberate. Every step carefully considered. I remembered something my mother had said years ago. Power isn't given. It's earned, and sometimes taken back when it's stolen. I realized that was my moment. The sacrifice, the loyalty, the sleepless nights, they weren't wasted. They were preparation. By the time I left my apartment that day, I felt a strange sense of calm. The storm hadn't ended, but I was no longer adrift in it. I had a plan, and more importantly, I had a reason to act, to reclaim not just my career, but my voice, my dignity, my strength. Because this wasn't just about standing up to one man. It was about standing up to the system that allowed men like him to believe they could break me. And I wasn't broken. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting in my lawyer's office, a small, unassuming building off Fort Bragg's main road. The smell of polished wood and old leather filled the room, and the hum of the air conditioner was steady, almost soothing. I had brought every piece of evidence I'd collected: emails, screenshots, witness statements, even my personal notes detailing every humiliation, every unjust reassignment. My lawyer, Ms. Ramirez, a sharp woman in her mid-40s with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun, flipped through the documents with a critical eye. "Lieutenant," she said finally, leaning back in her chair, "you have a strong case. What's happened to you is not discipline. It's harassment. And you have proof. I felt my chest tighten. For months, I doubted myself. I'd wondered if I was overreacting, if my instincts were exaggerating. But hearing it from her, a professional who dealt with military misconduct cases every day, it hit me like a wave. I wasn't powerless. I remember sitting there, fingers clasped together, as clarity settled over me. I wasn't just going to endure this. I was going to act. Ms. Ramirez laid out the plan. I would submit a formal complaint through the Inspector General's office. I would request a temporary reassignment away from Harris while the investigation took place. And I would make sure every piece of evidence was time-stamped, cataloged, and undeniable. She looked at me directly and said, "You have the chance to reclaim your dignity, Lieutenant. But you have to commit fully. No hesitation." I nodded. My throat was tight. My hands were still shaking, but my mind was sharper than it had been in months. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, reviewing the plan again. I thought about the fear I'd felt, the fear of retaliation, of gossip, of losing everything I'd worked for. And then I remembered something else, a memory from my first deployment. A young soldier had panicked during an exercise, and I had stepped in, guided her calmly, and saved the entire team from a failed mission. That day, I realized leadership wasn't about being liked or avoiding conflict. It was about standing firm when it mattered most. I realized that the fear I felt now was the same kind of fear. But instead of leading others, it was my turn to lead myself. By the next morning, I had submitted the complaint. I had attached every piece of evidence and included a detailed statement about Harris's pattern of abuse. When I hit send, my hands shook, but a strange calmness settled over me. For the first time since this all began, I felt in control. Because control wasn't about dominating others. It was about refusing to let them dominate you. That evening, as I walked back to my apartment, I noticed the way the sunset reflected off the streets, warm and unapologetic. I allowed myself a small smile. This was the turning point. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a woman with a plan, a purpose, and a voice. And I was ready to use it. After submitting the complaint, I knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. Harris was cunning. He thrived in gray areas, twisting facts, playing politics. I needed allies, people who had seen his behavior firsthand, who could back me up with truth, not opinion. I started quietly, sending messages to colleagues I trusted, asking if they had observed unfair treatment or harassment. Some responded immediately, others hesitated. But over a week, I compiled a list of witnesses willing to speak, each one confirming a pattern of favoritism, intimidation, and subtle cruelty. I also secured my financial and operational documents. Bank statements, mission logs, reports, emails. Everything stored safely on a personal encrypted drive. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. I had learned the hard way that bureaucracy could be manipulated, but facts were harder to argue with. During this time, I met with Ms. Ramirez again. She encouraged me to document my daily interactions with Harris, even the smallest ones, emails, messages, phone calls. "This isn't just about one incident," she said. "It's about showing a pattern. And the pattern is what will make your case undeniable." I took her advice seriously. Every morning, I arrived early at the base and spent an hour reviewing emails, noting comments in a small leather-bound notebook. Every whisper of a remark, every subtle undermining, it went in the book. One afternoon, I ran into Captain Allen, a senior officer who had once dismissed my complaints as overly sensitive. I explained the situation calmly, showed him the documentation I had gathered, and for the first time, I saw respect in his eyes. He didn't promise anything, but he nodded. "It looks like you've thought this through. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself." It was a small victory, but it mattered. I also started preparing for the confrontation itself. I wrote out questions, anticipated excuses, and even rehearsed my statements in front of a mirror. It wasn't about aggression. It was about clarity, calm, and unwavering truth. At home, I'd sit on my couch late at night, laptop open, reviewing every detail. I kept a cup of herbal tea by my side, the quiet hum of my apartment keeping me company. The process was exhausting, but it felt right. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to Harris. I was acting on my own terms. The day before the official meeting with the Inspector General's office, I paused and looked at myself in the mirror. I touched the badge pinned on my uniform. It was still the same badge that had been a source of frustration, humiliation, and anger. But now it felt different. It was a symbol of resilience, of persistence, of refusal to be silenced. I whispered to myself, this ends on my terms. Because the truth doesn't need drama to be powerful. It needs evidence, precision, and courage. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because I felt safe, I knew Harris would push back, but because I had reclaimed control of my story. And that control, I realized, was the first real step toward freedom. The morning of the meeting, I walked into the IG office with my evidence neatly organized in a folder and my witnesses ready. Harris was there, of course, sitting with the same smug expression he always wore, the one that implied he was untouchable. The investigator, a stern woman named Major Davis, called us in. Her presence alone demanded focus. There was no room for theatrics. Harris began immediately, his tone polite but sharp. "Lieutenant, I don't know why you're making such a big deal about this. I've only ever tried to guide you. Any suggestion otherwise is exaggerated." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "Sir, it's not exaggerated. I've documented your behavior, emails, messages, witness accounts. This isn't guidance. This is a consistent pattern of undermining, intimidation, and misuse of authority." He shifted in his seat, attempting a casual smile. "We all push boundaries sometimes. Surely, that's not grounds for an IG complaint." I leaned forward, calm but resolute. It is when those boundaries consistently target one person unfairly, when it affects their career, reputation, and mental health. And I have evidence that proves it. Major Davis flipped through my folder, her eyes scanning quickly but deliberately. Harris's smile faltered, just slightly. He knew he couldn't dismiss the documents outright. "I'd like to hear from the witnesses," she said. One by one, my colleagues spoke. They detailed instances where Harris had belittled me in front of others, reassigned me unfairly, and made subtle threats. Every account reinforced the same pattern. I felt a quiet surge of satisfaction. Not revenge, satisfaction that truth was finally being recognized. When the last witness finished, Harris attempted to interject. "These accounts are selective. They don't tell the whole story." I cut in, steady and unwavering. "They tell the truth, sir. And truth doesn't need your approval to exist." For the first time, he looked uncertain. His attempts to manipulate and intimidate were failing. I realized then that strength wasn't about yelling or lashing out. It was about showing up fully, calmly, and letting evidence speak louder than threats. By the end of the meeting, Major Davis thanked everyone and assured me the case would be reviewed thoroughly. Harris left without a word, his control shattered, at least for now. As I walked back to my apartment that evening, the streets were quiet. I let myself breathe for the first time in months. The weight I'd carried, humiliation, betrayal, fear, felt lighter. I knew this wasn't over. There would still be challenges, subtle retaliation, and doubts to face. But I had already won something more important than any official victory. I had reclaimed my voice. I sat by my window that night, my uniform folded neatly on the chair beside me. The city lights blinked softly in the distance. For the first time in months, I felt the quiet power of self-respect. Because standing up wasn't about defeating someone else. It was about refusing to be defeated. The days after the IG meeting were tense. Harris didn't speak to me directly, but his presence was a constant reminder that people who abuse power rarely go quietly. I could feel the subtle pushback, assignments that tested my patience, offhand comments in meetings, colleagues being cautious around me. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I kept meticulous records of every interaction, every reassignment, every comment. If Harris tried to manipulate or discredit me, I'd be ready. I no longer relied on hope or instinct. I relied on facts, precision, and my own unwavering resolve. One afternoon, during a routine briefing, he attempted to undermine me again. "Lieutenant, maybe you should double-check your report before presenting it next time," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. I looked him in the eye and replied calmly, "Thank you, sir. I already verified the data and included supporting evidence for all findings. If you'd like, I can walk the team through it again." There was a pause, long enough for everyone in the room to notice. Harris's jaw tightened. I didn't back down. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't shrinking. I was standing fully in my truth. Later that evening, I met with Ms. Ramirez again. She smiled faintly as I recounted the exchange. "This is good," she said. "You're no longer just defending yourself. You're asserting your authority and showing that you won't be intimidated." It felt empowering. Every subtle pushback from him, every attempt at control, only reminded me how far I'd come. I had turned fear into strategy, humiliation into preparation. I also realized that resilience isn't built in moments of comfort. It's forged in the fires of betrayal, humiliation, and doubt. And it's proven in the way you continue, step by step, without surrendering your dignity. The base began to notice the shift. Colleagues who had once looked at me with pity or skepticism now treated me with respect. Even some of Harris's allies started maintaining distance, uncertain how to react to a woman who had refused to be silenced. It was subtle, quiet power, the kind that doesn't need to roar to be felt. That night, I returned to my apartment, exhausted but alive in a way I hadn't been for months. I poured a glass of water, stared at my reflection in the kitchen window, and saw not the same person who had trembled under his words weeks ago. I saw someone who had been tested, humiliated, and betrayed, and had chosen to rise. Because fighting isn't always loud. Sometimes it's calm. Sometimes it's precise. And sometimes it's just refusing to be broken. I placed my hands on the edge of the counter and whispered to myself, I am not what he made me feel. I am more. The next day, I would continue the battle with clarity, evidence, and dignity. And I knew deep in my bones that justice was no longer just a possibility. It was inevitable. The final hearing came 2 weeks later. The room was quiet, heavy with anticipation. Harris entered with the same confident stride he always used. But this time, I didn't feel intimidated. I sat tall, hands folded over my folder of evidence, calm and ready. The Inspector General reviewed the documentation, questioned witnesses, and examined every email, message, and note I had meticulously gathered. Harris tried his usual tactics, downplaying incidents, framing his behavior as mentorship, implying I was oversensitive. I didn't flinch. I answered every question truthfully, calmly, and without apology. I let the evidence speak. Every witness reinforced the truth, a pattern of abuse, intimidation, and professional sabotage. By the end, the conclusion was clear. Harris's actions were not leadership, they were misconduct. The report recommended immediate corrective action, reassignment, and monitoring to ensure no further abuse occurred. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Not revenge, not victory in a petty sense, but the satisfaction of truth recognized, dignity restored. Walking out of the IG office that afternoon, the late afternoon sun fell warm on my shoulders. I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling the freedom that comes not from eliminating someone else, but from reclaiming your own power. Back in my apartment, I hung my uniform neatly and sat by the window. I reflected on everything, the humiliation, the betrayal, the sleepless nights, and the relentless planning. Every moment had led to this, not just the resolution, but my growth. I touched the badge on my desk, a symbol of everything I had worked for. Once it had felt heavy with shame. Now it felt lighter, almost like a talisman of resilience. Sometimes I think about Harris, about the man who tried to remind me of my place. I don't hate him. I pity the weakness it takes to try to diminish others to feel powerful. I've learned that true strength isn't about control. It's about accountability, honesty, and integrity. I've learned that humiliation can teach you nothing if you don't rise from it. And I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to act, even when fear is present. As the city lights blinked on, I whispered quietly to myself, echoing the thought I started with months ago. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't about shouting. It's about finally refusing to bow your head. And now I never will. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Write it in the comments.